Hey, welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're going after one of the most misunderstood words in modern life. You've heard it in wellness reels, productivity threads, parenting blogs, and probably from your own mouth at some point. Dopamine, the so called pleasure chemical, the thing you're supposedly chasing every time you reach for your phone. I want to start with a small confession because I think it sets up everything we're about to talk about. For years, I believed the cartoon version too. Dopamine equals pleasure, more dopamine equals more happiness, so life becomes a game of squeezing out little hits wherever you can find them. It's a tidy story. It's also, according to the actual science, mostly wrong. And here's the part that matters for you and me. That wrong story quietly shapes how we treat ourselves. If you think dopamine is pleasure, then a restless, unsatisfied, scrolling kind of day feels like a personal failure. If you understand what dopamine is really doing, that same day starts to look less like a character flaw and more like a system doing exactly what it was built to do. So that's our stride today. We're going to walk from confusion to clarity, and then from clarity to something you can use. 5 stops on the way: what dopamine actually is, why it works so differently from one person to the next, how our screens have learned to play it like an instrument, what it has to do with focus and aging, and finally, what to do about all of it, including which popular fixes are worth your time and which ones are just good marketing. Let's take the first step. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Dopamine is not primarily a pleasure signal, it's a prediction and motivation signal. The current research points to dopamine as a kind of adaptive control system, something that updates your expectations when reality surprises you, tags certain cues as worth chasing, and gives you the push to actually go get them. Let me translate that because those words can slide right past you. Picture your brain running a quiet, constant prediction about what's coming next. You bite into an apple expecting it to taste like an apple. When it does, nothing dramatic happens. But if that apple were secretly a caramel apple, you'd get a little jolt of surprise. And that jolt is the interesting part. Neuroscientists call it a reward prediction error, which is a formal way of saying the gap between what you expected and what you actually got. Dopamine tracks that gap. It's less a burst of joy and more a teaching signal, a nudge that says, update your model. That was better than you thought. We're not guessing at this. In one experiment, when researchers used light to artificially create that prediction error signal at the moment a reward arrived, animals learned the cue reward connection faster and it stuck. That's a causal fingerprint, not just a correlation. And the signal isn't reward happened, it's reward minus expectation. Once a reward becomes fully predictable, the dopamine response to it fades, even though the pleasure of the thing itself hasn't gone anywhere, which already tells you dopamine and pleasure are not the same event. The cleanest evidence for that separation comes from a distinction I find quietly profound. There's a difference between wanting something and liking something, and the research places dopamine much closer to the wanting side. Scientists call this incentive salience, which is a fancy phrase for the magnetic pull a cue can have over you. Think about a food you're not even hungry for, but the moment you smell it, some part of you leans in. That leaning in is dopamine's territory. The warm satisfaction once you're actually eating, the of it, runs on separate systems and can happen even when dopamine is low. If you've ever compulsively wanted something and then felt oddly flat, once you got it, you've felt this gap firsthand. The wanting and the liking came apart. That's not a glitch in you, that's the architecture. Now, I want to be careful because the science has moved past even the simple prediction error story. Dopamine turns out to be more of a committee than a single voice. Studies suggest different populations of dopamine neurons handle different jobs, some leaning toward reward prediction, others toward motivation and the value of effort. Some signals seem to track how hard you're willing to work rather than learning at all. And a few researchers argue that certain classic learning patterns might be better explained by moment to moment performance than by learning itself. Newer reviews now fold in belief states, surprise, and even punishment signals to make sense of it all. So, if you take one thing from this first stretch, take this. Dopamine isn't the brain's reward for a life well lived. It's closer to the brain's motivation engine and its learning teacher, the thing that helps you figure out what matters, predict what's coming, and decide whether an action is worth the cost. Pleasure is still real, and dopamine isn't completely irrelevant to it, since some studies show it can shape the enjoyment of things as abstract as music. But calling dopamine the pleasure chemical is like calling a car's GPS the engine related to the trip, not the thing that makes you go. Here's a question I get asked in different forms all the time. Why does the exact same thing, the same reward, the same goal, light one person up and leave the person next to them completely cold? One friend gets a runner's high and becomes evangelical about 6 a.m. workouts. Another does the same runs and feels nothing but sore. Same reward, wildly different pull. Part of the answer lives in the fact that dopamine systems are not identical from person to person. Research shows they vary at several levels, from the genes that build the receptors to the regulators that control how much dopamine gets released, all the way up to how stress and life experience have reshaped the circuits over time. On the genetic side, certain common variations seem to tilt temperament rather than dictate destiny. Studies have linked variations in a few dopamine receptor genes to traits like impulsivity, novelty seeking, and persistence, and another gene variant shows up in some research on focus and stress resilience. I'd hold these findings a little loosely because the gene to personality links are often inconsistent and easy to overstate. There's also a subtler regulator worth mentioning, a kind of thermostat that controls how much dopamine gets released. When that thermostat runs weaker, research has tied it to novelty chasing, impulsivity, and higher addiction vulnerability. So some of us are running a slightly more sensitive setting, and that shapes how loud our wanting gets. But genes are only the opening line. Stress rewrites the script, and it does something counterintuitive that I think everyone should know. A short burst of stress you can cope with tends to rev up dopamine activity, which helps you rise to the moment. Chronic, grinding, uncontrollable stress does the opposite. Research shows it suppresses that same system, dampening reward sensitivity in a way that's been connected to both depression and addiction risk. That's the neurobiology behind a feeling a lot of us know too well. When life is relentless for long enough, the things that used to move you stop moving you. It's not that you've become lazy or ungrateful. Your reward system has turned its own volume down. And here's where resilience gets interesting because it isn't simply more dopamine. In one striking study of mice under social stress, the resilient ones didn't have more dopamine across the board. They had more dopamine activity at the moment they engaged with the threat and fought back, while the more vulnerable animals showed their activity when retreating. Read that again with a human lens. Resilience looked like a reward signal tied to facing the hard thing, not avoiding it. I don't want to overextend an animal study, but it's a suggestive picture of what it might mean to be built or trained to find the pull inside the struggle rather than only in the escape. But this same machinery shows up in the clinic. In Parkinson's disease, where dopamine cells are lost, research shows people don't just move more slowly, they can lose the willingness to exert effort, and restoring dopamine can restore some of that drive. In ADHD, differences in dopamine related signaling sit right at the intersection of reward motivation and attention. None of this makes anyone's motivation a moral scoreboard. It makes it a biological setting, one shaped by genes, stress, hormones, and history all at once. So when you catch yourself asking why you can't just want the good for you thing the way someone else seems to, sit with this. The reward doesn't land in a vacuum, it lands in your specific nervous system, tuned by a lifetime of inputs. That's not an excuse. It's a starting point for working with yourself instead of against yourself. Okay. If dopamine is fundamentally a learning and motivation system built to help us survive an unpredictable world, then a fair question is what happens when we hand that ancient system over to technology engineered by very smart people to hold our attention. And the honest answer is that our devices seem to have learned to speak dopamine's native language almost fluently. Start with the design detail that does the heavy lifting, the variable reward. Likes, comments, notifications, and messages don't arrive on a schedule. They come unpredictably in unpredictable sizes, which is the same structure that makes a slot machine so sticky. Remember our prediction error signal from earlier, the one that fires on surprise? Unpredictable rewards keep that signal firing over and over because your brain can never fully settle its prediction. So you check and check again, not because you're weak, but because the system is doing precisely what it evolved to do when rewards are uncertain and worth sampling. There's real research showing our behavior on these platforms follows the same reinforcement learning rules we see in the lab. One study found that people time their posts to maximize social reward, weighing the payoff against the effort. And when researchers manipulate those social rewards, behavior shifts in predictable ways. Visible likes and approval light up reward circuitry deep in the brain, and studies suggest the brain treats that social feedback as biologically meaningful rather than as trivial little icons. That's worth pausing on. To your reward system, a like isn't a pixel. It's closer to a member of your tribe nodding in approval, which is something we were built to care about deeply. Then the platforms stack newer tricks on top: infinite scroll, autoplay, pull to refresh, and personalized recommendations create a stream of compressed, frequent, cheap to sample reward opportunities. Fast, short form video appears to train the brain toward higher arousal seeking, which can quietly make slower, effortful things, like reading a chapter or finishing a report, feel unbearably dull by comparison. Large studies in young people link heavy smartphone use and media multitasking with more impulsive, less flexible decision making. And a few studies hint at deeper changes, like lower dopamine related activity in adults who spend a higher share of their phone time on social apps. I do want to keep my footing here because the loudest claims are the shakiest. The idea that screens are directly and permanently frying or dysregulating your dopamine in humans is still more inferred than proven, and the reviews making that leap tend to be cautious about causation for good reason. So I won't sell you a panic. What the better evidence supports is subtler and I think more useful. Many digital systems are optimized to repeatedly capture the exact reward learning machinery that normally guides us toward meaningful things and point it instead toward frequent, shallow sampling. The tools aren't breaking a broken brain, they're playing a healthy brain expertly, which brings us to the real question of this segment. Are today's technologies exploiting motivational systems that evolution never prepared us for? I'd say yes, though maybe not as villains. Evolution tuned this system for a world where rewards were scarce and effortful, where check for food or check for social threat was a survival move. Our devices took that same instinct and made the checking infinite, free, and always one thumb flick away. The instinct is ancient and adaptive. The environment is brand new. That mismatch is most of the story. Let's connect all this to something you actually feel every working day: focus, willpower, the ability to hold a goal in mind while the world tries to knock it out of your hands. This is where dopamine meets your prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain that handles planning, working memory, and self control. And here's the twist that surprises almost everyone: when it comes to thinking clearly, more dopamine is not better. The research shows the relationship is shaped like an upside down U. Picture a hill, too little dopamine, and you're on the low slope on one side, with weak focus and a working memory that keeps dropping things. Too much, and you slide down the other side into scattered, rigid, or overwhelmed thinking. The sweet spot is the top of the hill, a narrow optimal range where dopamine helps your prefrontal circuits hold a goal steady and shrug off distraction. A large analysis pooling dozens of studies found exactly this curved relationship, strongest for one particular receptor type involved in working memory. What is dopamine actually doing at that peak? In the models, it deepens the stable brain states that keep a thought online while quieting the background noise, so the important information doesn't get drowned out. Think of it like the difference between trying to hold a conversation in a quiet room versus a loud one. The right amount of dopamine turns down the room. It stabilizes the signal you're trying to keep in mind. This is also why the same intervention can help one person and hurt another, because it all depends on where you're sitting on that hill to begin with. Give a dopamine boosting nudge to someone running low, and you might push them up toward the peak. Give the same nudge to someone already near the top, and you might shove them over the edge. Your baseline is the whole game. Now layer in real life, because your position on that hill is not fixed. Research shows acute uncontrollable stress floods the prefrontal cortex with dopamine and can take those higher thinking networks offline almost in real time. That's the neurobiology of, I know I'm smart, but my mind went completely blank in that meeting. It's not a lack of ability, it's a system briefly knocked off its peak. Chronic stress can flip you to the opposite problem, a depleted state that also drags working memory down. And aging tends to shift the whole system too, with changes in dopamine related circuits linked to slower working memory and harder task switching, though some older adults show compensating changes that soften the decline. So, the answer to when does dopamine help thinking and when does it hurt is refreshingly humbling. It helps when it stays near that optimal middle. Too little weakens your grip on goals. Too much, especially under stress, disrupts your control, and the exact tipping point depends on your age, the brain region, the task, and where your baseline already sits. There's no universal high dopamine equals high performance. There's only your curve and the conditions that move you along it. Here's where we turn the corner from understanding to doing, because understanding the machinery is only valuable if it changes how you live. And I'll be straight with you about something up front. The most defensible strategies here are almost boring. The exciting sounding ones are usually the ones with the least evidence behind them. Let's start with the boring, effective truth. The best supported interventions aren't about boosting dopamine at all. They're about shaping your learning, your effort, your environment, and your feedback. Take habits. The research says stop waiting to feel motivated and instead repeat a rewarded action in a stable context until the context itself starts pulling the behavior out of you. Motivation is a lousy foundation because it comes and goes. A cue that reliably triggers a small action is far sturdier. This is dopamine informed, but the target is behavior design, not neurotransmitter micromanagement. There's a related idea from depression treatment that I wish more people knew called behavioral activation. It flips the usual order of operations. Instead of waiting to feel like doing the meaningful, effortful thing, you do the thing first and let contact with the reward come after. Given what we now understand about dopamine and effort, that order makes real sense. Your reward signal often shows up as you engage, not before. So, action can be the thing that generates the drive rather than the reward for having it. Exercise earns its reputation, but not for the reason people usually give. It's not a simple dopamine dispenser. The evidence suggests it helps because physical activity supports the brain's capacity to adapt, and because it builds self regulation over time, which is a slower and more durable benefit than any single mood spike. The catch, and it's an honest one, is that people respond very differently, and the benefit depends on sticking with it rather than one heroic session. Mindfulness lands in a similar place. Research suggests it strengthens the self regulation that healthy behavior change depends on, though the studies are still working out exactly how and for whom. For the digital side, the intervention follows straight from what we said about screens. If variable, frequent rewards are the problem, Then changing the reward architecture around your notifications, feeds, and checking is the lever. Fewer high frequency, unpredictable pings, more structured effort pointed at things you actually value. You're not trying to numb your reward system, you're trying to stop feeding it junk on a slot machine schedule. Now, the part you've been waiting for. What about the dopamine hacks? Dopamine fasting, cold plunges as a dopamine reset, supplements, the whole genre of detox your dopamine in 7 days. I'll say it plainly. These are the weakest claims in the entire field. Scientists who study this point out that the dopamine system is complex, context dependent, and still not fully understood even at the level of the target cells, which makes sweeping promises of a clean reset scientifically premature. The whole framing of more dopamine good, less dopamine bad collapses the moment you remember that upside down you. Direction depends entirely on where you started. So, a blanket hack aimed at everyone is aiming at nobody in particular. That doesn't mean nothing pharmacological works. It means the real interventions are specific and matched to conditions, not sold as consumer self optimization. Dopamine related medications are well established for something like ADHD. And the research frontier in addiction and motivation is moving toward personalized, biomarker guided approaches that account for a person's stress biology and individual differences rather than one size fits all dopamine boosting. Even AI assisted tools and coaching apps show some promise as scaffolds, offering personalized goals and real time feedback, though the evidence on how well they last and generalize is still thin. Pull it together, and the practical lesson is almost the opposite of the popular advice. Don't chase dopamine. Design your environment and your routines so that learning, effort, and cue control get easier, and then respect that you are not everyone else and your curve is your own. So let's stand at the top of the trail and look back at where we walked. Dopamine isn't your pleasure, it's your prediction engine and your motivation teacher, tracking the gap between what you expected and what you got, and pulling you toward what might be worth the effort. It runs differently in each of us, tuned by genes and stress and history, which is why the same reward can grip one person and slide right off another. Our technology has learned to play this system with uncomfortable skill, turning an ancient instinct for scarce rewards loose in a world of infinite free ones. And when it comes to focus, the goal was never maximum dopamine, but the right amount held near the top of that gentle hill. Here's what I hope you carry out of here, because it's the reframe that helped me most. That restless, wanting, never quite satisfied feeling you sometimes get is not proof that something is broken in you. It's the sound of a motivation system working exactly as designed in an environment that keeps whispering, check again, want more, this time it'll pay off. Once you can hear it for what it is, you stop fighting yourself and start redesigning the environment around yourself. You put the effortful, valued things within reach and the slot machine rewards a little further away. You act first and let the drive catch up. You aim for your peak, not somebody else's. That's the stride from confusion to a solution you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.